Hello there, and welcome to today's webcast, Cybersecurity at the Edge, Rethinking a Security Strategy to Support the New Work from Home Normal. I'm Dustin Heisler. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at eRepublik, and I'm excited to serve as the host for today's webcast. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great session over the next 30 minutes. As state and local agencies across the country have responded to this global pandemic, public sector workforces and workplaces have rapidly shifted to a new remote normal, working from home. Of work requires agencies to rethink everything, especially cybersecurity, to counter these new and growing threats as it relates to remote workers. And over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be having the first of many new conversations under a new initiative that we call the Crisis Response Initiative. This is a joint initiative between government technology and governing, focused on aggregating data, news, virtual conversations like today's, as well as industry resources, many of which are also loaded up in the webinar resources section of this webinar, all designed to equip government leaders with tactics necessary to respond to this crisis and the new normal ahead. Before we begin, I just wanted to share a few quick, brief housekeeping notes that are for you on the screen. And while I do that, I want to take a moment just to introduce the individuals that we've got and the experts that we have assembled to help us unpack the state of cybersecurity for the new normal. Today's industry experts include Dan Lorman, the former Chief Security Officer for the state of Michigan, Maria Thompson, the current State Chief Risk Officer for the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, and Mark Weatherford, the former First Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So we've got an all-star crew that's going to go through all of the great tactics necessary to deal with the new normal of cybersecurity. So the first thing we're going to do is really talk about the national landscape, what's happening. Then we're going to look at how agencies are responding with Maria, and then we're going to talk about this new normal with Dan. And before you know it, 30 minutes will be up. So why cybersecurity? Well, we know that this has always been the #1 priority for state and local government leaders across the country. And this new shift in format and medium of work has really made this a mission-critical issue for agencies to tackle, because now the threat environment is your employees' homes. And so we really want to talk about how this is going to impact state and local government agencies. So with that, I want to bring in Mark Weatherford and talk a little bit about what's happening today. So Mark, thanks so much for joining us. Just tell us a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted the cybersecurity landscape today.
Well, Dustin, first thing I want to take a little issue with what you just said. I don't think that cybersecurity has been the #1 priority for government agencies for a long time. In fact, that's one of the things that Dan and Maria and I struggle with often, is to get that kind of visibility with our government leaders to be able to fund and resource the projects and initiatives we have. So I would say, I think, this may sound, maybe unreasonable, but one of the things I think we've learned, or perhaps relearned, is that cyber criminals generally have very little respect for critical services. The fact that hospitals, aid organizations, supercomputers doing COVID-19 research, and many others have recently been hacked shows how little regard these people have for society and their fellow citizens. But with respect specifically to COVID-19, I think as organizations began ramping up for more demand on existing systems, like, for example, processing applications for the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, it became very clear that having documented and tested business continuity plans is critical. The worst time to figure out you need to execute a business continuity strategy is during a disaster. So unemployment applications have been particularly highlighted in this instance, I think, and it reminds me, honestly, of the build-up to Y2K. A lot of things were happening, although there we had more time to plan and prepare. But state governments whose unemployment insurance systems run on COBOL found themselves in a pretty dicey situation when demand spiked and they didn't have enough COBOL programmers available to maintain those systems that were, now being taxed very heavily. So this isn't necessarily a security problem, but what is a security issue is the urgency to roll out the pandemic unemployment assistance to millions of people overnight. There were inadvertent vulnerabilities introduced that exposed citizen PII. Now, these states are probably going to end up spending, thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in forensics and mitigation. That's money that could have been spent otherwise. And so the point here is, I think, the lack of preparedness and the lack of appropriate software development due diligence is almost always the first casualty in an emergency situation like this. So the lesson here is that being prepared is money well spent. But again, that's something that those of us in the security business have been saying for a long, long time.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important message for, those CIOs and those CISOs to really take to their boards and to take to their leaders today. So with the push to remote work and workers, what are some of the new threats that are emerging that government leaders should be aware of today?
Yeah. Well, I think, vulnerabilities in applications like Zoom, which got a lot of headlines immediately, I think show that, like I said earlier, bad guys don't necessarily have the kind of moral compass that most of us aspire to. So this means that a lot of threats that were formerly directed at government and business organizations are now being redirected at those same employees who are working from the kitchen table or the sofa. So it doesn't take a big leap of imagination to see how conducting business and assessing systems, critical data from like your home computer, creates huge gaps in the overall security of an organization. For example, email-based threats that were formerly filtered, quarantined, and blocked by an organization's internal security systems and software, and now completely dependent upon a home user's security. So that should frighten you a lot, just that statement right there. Because, most home users don't have adequate Wi-Fi router security. They don't have VPNs. They're far more susceptible to phishing scams at home. And they have, significantly less stringent password requirements, among a host of other things. So all of this basically leads to far less security than organizations typically deal with. So government and business security teams should be actively pushing their leadership for more security training for these remote employees.
So, thinking about kind of prioritizing response, what state and local leaders should, do, there's a lot of things on their plate right now. What are some of the most important elements that state and local leaders should know as it relates to the cybersecurity landscape today?
Well, probably no surprise. I think, number one, bad things are going to happen. We just need to, that's part of this new normal that Dan's going to talk about. Bad things are going to happen. So whether it's naive employees or malicious bad guys, we're going to see an uptick in security issues. That's just, that's jacks are better to open right there. Number two, business continuity planning is an ongoing process. And just because organizations haven't done it yet doesn't mean the window is closed and that they shouldn't be trying to do that to create that positive impact on the business now. So remote work is here to stay. And, while it will certainly decrease in volume from where it is today, I think, organizations have discovered that, there's a lot of efficiencies and cost savings associated with it. So that's the number one issue right there. So next, I think one of the continuing problems around all government organizations, whether it's state, federal, or local, is where do citizens call? So in the issue in Arkansas and in Illinois, citizens actually discovered vulnerabilities within the unemployment application, but they spent several days trying to getting passed around and trying to reach the right people that could actually take action on that. So, government organizations need to have a 1-800 number, 24/7 1-800 number that citizens can call into and report potential security issues. And finally, when a crisis or a disaster strikes, the urgency of the situation almost always overrides the existing security protocols. I mean, we've seen it happen over and over and over again. And this is where self-inflicted damage often occurs. A good friend of mine, he was the disaster control officer on board USS Stark in 1987 when they were struck by a couple of Iraqi missiles. And it almost sunk the ship, but he was responsible for saving the ship. And I've heard him say this a number of times, and it always comes back to me, and it comes back to me. And in this case is that he learned that day, he said, training does work, and my shipmate's training was directly responsible for saving the ship. The second thing he said is, When stuff hits the fan, remaining in control and following training is the path to survival. I think, we need to remember that last one right there. Training does help us recover from incidents like this. And I'm not trying to create any kind of equivalency between, what's happening and the strike on the Stark, but that is an important point for us to remember. So all of that said, my advice is pretty simple. Have a plan. Be as prepared as possible for that black swan event that might threaten your organization. We used to call it the $1 billion question. What is the one thing that would cost your company or your organization $1 billion that you could do something about today? So, you don't do this kind of strategic planning in the heat of the moment, and that's why it's called strategic planning.
Well said. Well, thanks so much for sharing your insights. And I think that was, exactly on point with these state and local leaders that are dealing with this. This is something that's going to impact everyone, regardless of their organization size, regardless of your type of agency. This is a real risk that you need to prioritize and think about now, especially as this threat vector has changed. So, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. I want to bring Maria into the conversation now and talk a little bit, first around how COVID-19 has impacted your workforce and operations in the state of North Carolina.
So the quick answer is it has impacted us. And Mark hit a lot of the key points that we're dealing with from a state and local government aspect. I would say on the good side, the pros of COVID, if I can say that, is one of the things that we've noticed is that some of the agencies that have been more resistant to a unified approach to cybersecurity have come to the realization that they have to work together because we're all dealing with the same levels of deficiencies that we may have. Some of those deficiencies are related to endpoint visibility and endpoint compliance. And so, taking a unified approach allows us to gain a better handle on the environment, especially since most of our users, our state and local users, are working remote. And I know Mark touched on some of the vulnerabilities that we have to deal with, with users that may have forgotten the fact that they're still required to maintain compliance and to do the same things, the best practices that we've been pushing through cyber awareness training and also our phishing exercises. So some of the things that we've been doing actually is to continue to push forward our cyber awareness training to them as a mandatory requirement, and also to continue our phishing exercises. So to make sure that they haven't forgotten that these are common threats that are out there. And that's part of the end user protection, I call it. How do we protect them from themselves? And when we think about the end users and what they're dealing with, we want to realize, and we've been working with them, is to give them the solutions, because they're going to try to find any kind of solution out there to meet their needs as they work remote. And so if they're not able to have those solutions, they're going to try to download and try to do those shadow IT activities that potentially can bring a harm to the network. We're also looking at new technologies. There's a lot of new technologies that have come into play. I call it the good idea fairies that pop up with these new solutions that will help to fix XYZ. And we understand that there is a huge pressure on certain agencies as well to produce technologies that will enable them to complete their mission to support the citizens, whether it's from an unemployment perspective or it's from a COVID reporting perspective. So being able to support them and make sure that we're able to be part of that discussion, be at the table to make sure that security is embedded in all these decisions so we don't end up with something that we have to clean up retroactively. And then, of course, fraud detection is a big thing, and Mark touched on it. We've seen across all the states that there's a huge uptick in fraud with these unemployment claims. So these are some of the things that we're dealing with. This is our new norm right now.
That's really fascinating. And I'm, kind of looking, I want to dig in a little bit to how things have changed. And so I know there's been this massive migration to work from home. Has that changed how you manage and mitigate digital risk? And have you learned anything along the way with that?
Well, I think one of the things what's helped us with the COVID initiative is that within the cybersecurity realm, we've known for some time that the boundary has shifted, that it's no longer contained and it's at the individual endpoints. But I think one of the greater realization is that everyone is realizing that everyone across our business users, our state and local government, those folks that are not traditional IT folks are getting a better appreciation of that shifting landscape. And so some of the things that we've had to put in place is to take a look at how we manage our exception processes and our waiver processes. We have users that are going to request certain solutions, and sometimes I'll be completely transparent. They may leverage the COVID initiative as a way to fast track some of these solutions and these installations and implementations on the network. So we've had to take a look at how we tighten down and get a better handle on how we manage these individual exceptions, allowing them to still have their operational capability, but reducing the risk over time. Vendor support, I will say that, and I'm very thankful. We've had a huge increase in vendor support during COVID, but that has had having us to take a look at how do we manage these vendors over time? Is the juice worth the squeeze? When we implement these solutions that are here for 30, 60, 90 days that they're being offered as a free solution, does it really make sense for us to implement that at this time? And so even though we're thankful for all of these solutions that our vendor partners are offering, we have to really take a concerted effort at and making a decision as to what makes sense for us to implement during this time. Workforce, how do we train our workforce to support the new solutions that we're deploying? And one of the things we've seen is, yes, there is, with the new solutions, we have to make sure that the workforce is properly trained. And sometimes that means that we leverage our vendor partners to help fast track these programs and allow us to have the ability to train our folks up so that they can take over the new solutions that we're deploying. So these are some of the risks that we're focusing on right now. And of course, the big thing is how do we reintegrate these solutions back into the environment after they've been off the network for 2 months, 3 months, so on and so forth. So planning for that, being part of a crisis team and a recovery team is very crucial to making sure that we manage those risks over time. And some of the things we've learned, and this is a personal lessons learned for me, was understanding that as a cyber professional, we don't have to have the answers for everything. We need to work together with all the operations team, because sometimes there are solutions that they have that actually can answer our cyber needs, but we tend to sometimes be in our own corner. We look at the tools that we have and the capabilities that we have, not understanding that there are other solutions out there that can be leveraged to meet those needs. Case in point, recovering to the new norm. There are solutions out there that we can tap into that can give us the visibility that we need and not necessarily just focus on the tools that we have within our toolkit.
That's great. So, I mean, you've been incredibly busy. You and your team have done some phenomenal work there. So I want to talk a little bit about, what people, process, technology elements you've put in place to aid in this COVID-19 response in North Carolina. Can you speak to that?
So I think one of the biggest solutions that we've really looked at is virtual desktop and, solutions like that, because working in an IT organization, it is very easy for us to deploy on a remote environment, because most of our employees have laptops. That's how we've always been provisioned. We are ready and set. We can work remote for quite a long time. That's not the same for a lot of our customers and a lot of the state and local entities that are out there. And so one of the things we've seen is that there was a huge increase in need for desktop support. They needed endpoints because, believe it or not, in this day and age, people are still getting desktop solutions and not necessarily laptops that make them a little bit more mobile. So we've had to leverage our contracts to get fast track ordering of laptops and those types of devices. But if we had had a VDI solution in place, that would have helped us to better enable these users over the long period. So those are the things that we're looking at, is a VDI solution. endpoint consolidation and management is, again, I touched on that before, is very key for us right now, because we need to get a better handle on those endpoints and be able to interrogate them, know what's going on with them at any given time. So how can we pull that into an enterprise visibility so we haven't lost an understanding of where our risks are within the environment? I mentioned fraud analytics. And then, of course, I would say communication is always key throughout this whole thing, because as we work remote, it is important that we're always communicating, not just with our customers, but with ourselves, to see where we can have synergies so that we can better protect the environment and get a better understanding of what is going on. So these are some of the things, intel sharing. These are not things that are new. But I'll tell you that there are things that the oldies but goodies, I like to call them, that we have to focus on and continue to focus on to maintain a secure environment over time.
That's fantastic. And last question for you is, when you look kind of ahead at the new normal ahead, how has this changed what you're prioritizing? In addition to those things that you mentioned, has this disrupted some of your existing plans? Are you focused now on other things? Love to get your perspective there.
No, actually, surprisingly not. This year, one of my strategic goals this year was to focus on SOAR, automation. How can we orchestrate and automate more to get the best bang for the buck out of the tools that we currently have in our environment? So again, enterprise visibility has always been on the one of my number one priorities. It has not changed. And how are we able to enable our threat teams to make sure that they can have a quicker time to react and quicker time to recover? And one of the things as I mentioned before, was through automation and orchestration. So that has not changed. But I would say one of the other solutions we're looking at is how do we deploy a GRC so we can track a lot of the changes that have occurred within the environment so that we can have proper reporting and monitoring of that over time. So the only thing I would say that's really changed is looking at new solutions that will enable the remote worker and a more secure way of doing that over time.
Fantastic. Well, Maria, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights. So I want to bring Dan Lorman into the conversation. And Dan has been on top of everything that's happening as it relates to cybersecurity. He writes a column for GovTech. He's one of the foremost experts in the space. So Dan, tell us a little bit about, in your perspective, what's happening. We've seen frontline staff behaviors change significantly with COVID-19. They're now working from home. What's going on?
Well, first of all, thanks, Dustin, for having me. It's great to be with you today. I like to break it down into kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So 3 different groups. First, from the good side, as we just heard from Mark and Maria, a lot of people are doing great at this. Polls say that people love to telework. We just heard this at the NASIO mid-year. People enjoy working from home. They're figuring it out if they don't have the tools in place. So the good is, the productivity has been there. Most states and local governments say they're going to keep doing it, and so it's been positive. I think on the bad side, we heard some of that from Maria. A lot of the areas did not have laptops when they started out, and so they literally, a lot of governments brought desktops from people's homes into their houses. There were all kinds of different. I guess 73%. Of employees in a recent Kaspersky study said that they had not received any specific cybersecurity training, guidance, or direction from their employees. And now, again, that's a scary number. That's a global number from Kaspersky. But there's a number of other studies, PCmatic and others, that show similar kind of numbers. So I think there's some people that are doing it really, really well, and the people that were prepared and had the laptops. But then the third thing I'd say in the bad side would be shadow IT. A lot of people are using their own home, instant messaging, video conferencing. We saw that, the Zoom things Mark mentioned. And then also file storage. Are people backing things up on their home PCs? Is that, secure? Are they using USB drives? Is it sensitive data that they're backing up appropriate ways? So those are some of the bad. And then on the ugly side, just a couple quick ones. That same Kaspersky study, this is scary. a third of the people admitted to visiting adult websites during work on their home computers. So that's not good. Or we're seeing some of the data breaches in some of these states. That we just were mentioned with Mark in Illinois and Arkansas, but even fraud numbers. Washington State just came out with a report that people are getting stolen identities and they're using that to apply for unemployment benefits. So trying to get, and all the states are struggling with that. So trying to get over that is a challenge.
That's great. So I love that kind of breakdown. So there's been a lot of behavioral shifts in response to COVID-19. What behaviors do you think are here to stay, and what's going to go?
Yeah. So as I kind of implied in my first answer, I think there's a lot of governments that are doing great, and so a lot of those same behaviors as you just heard from me are going to stay. So I like to talk about the leaders, the followers, and the laggards. So for the leaders, a lot of it's going to stay the same, as you just heard from Maria. Mike Leahy said in Maryland, the CIO of Maryland during the NASCIO mid-year, that they're going to go to telework, work from home first. And then if you want to go back to the office, you do that as, only when necessary, certainly for the duration of the pandemic, but maybe even afterwards. He said that's going to, they're shifting their whole state approach. I'm hearing that from more and more people around the world, around the states, local governments. So I think you're going to see more and more telework, work from home, that kind of thing. I think that the challenge of what's going to go is where the people are struggling. The examples I just gave from Kaspersky and others, where they're talking about I'm using home PCs and maybe they weren't configured properly. The people, the process, and the technology weren't in place. They didn't have the training. They didn't have the different tools that they needed to really do their job and really process the things they needed to be processing. So I think people are going to take another look at how can we put better people process technology wherever those holes are? How do we fill those gaps? And as Mark said so well in the first segment, people are putting out fires, and they're doing that right now. And so they're changing some of the things in their approaches moving forward. Because remember, this won't just be for, a lot of people thought it was going to be 4, 6, 8 weeks. Now they're talking months or maybe even, till the end of the year or more.
So where should state and local leaders look for guidance or best practices in this evolving cybersecurity landscape?
Yeah, I think when you talk about resources, we've got a number of them up on the screen. I love NASCIO, the National Association of State CIOs, has got a great website. They list in that website, and they also have a guide, a white paper that you can go to that lists like 30 different corporate sponsors who have white papers on how you can better do implementations, work from home, these different challenges. Also, you see there on your screen a lot of examples from Public Technology Institute. Right here from GovTech, Governing Magazine has a lot of great resources that are listed there. I always like to go to NIST, the Cybersecurity Resource Center has got kind of ongoing great resources for people to use that you can keep going back to even beyond the pandemic. But all these are great resources online. I would put top of the list, go to the NASCIO website. They got a great website.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And so last question for you is just around this kind of new normal that we keep describing. What do you think the new normal is going to look like for cybersecurity for state and local government?
Well, first of all, we started hearing, around the country, layoffs, tough budgets, people are cutting, will there be federal stimulus? There's a lot of challenges people are facing right now. And Mark hit on this, first of all, addressing those data breaches, those challenges. There are going to be audit findings. A lot of people were prepared. A lot of people weren't prepared. So filling those holes, I think, is going to be that first step. As Mark mentioned, I think work from home is going to be here to stay certainly for many, many people for the duration of the pandemic, or certainly for many months. You're going to see a lot of moves to the cloud. So the people that were using Office 365 or 365, data in the cloud, protections around that from a cybersecurity perspective, making sure that the right tools are in place to protect that. I also think, and Maria hit on this real well, I'll kind of close on this one, but, really cybersecurity supporting the main business functions where you've seen the surges. So, of course, all the states are dealing with unemployment, huge challenge. We've talked about Arkansas and Illinois. To you, all 48 states are looking at this right now. As my website rock solid, hopefully we won't be hearing about any more data breaches from unemployment websites. But wherever those surges have been in health organizations, whatever it may be, cybersecurity needs to be at the table and working with them to make sure we can provide that. And I'll give you one more. Center for Digital Government is really all about, we're moving to digital government. So, people want to be able to sign forms online. They want to be able to process things online. We're really going to finally end, after about 30 years, the paperless office, I think, hopefully. So we're going to really be moving things online digitally. So making sure those processes, whatever that means for your business, are secure end to end. People, process, technology, and looking at the holes and filling those holes.
Well said, Dan. Thanks so much for joining. And I do want to be respectful of our time commitment, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. We've covered a lot of ground in 30 minutes, and I just want to thank Mark, Maria, and Dan for sharing their insights on today's webcast. And I also want to thank our crisis response partners, including Cisco, DocuSign, IBM, and Tenable, for making it possible to have this webcast discussion today. Make sure you check out the resources in the webinar resources section of this webcast, as well as the Crisis Response Initiative at govtech.com/crisis response or governing.com/crisis response. And thanks to you all for sticking with us for 30 minutes as we plowed through the state of cybersecurity post-COVID. We look forward to seeing you again at another GovTech and Governing event. Have a great rest of your day.